On Christmas night, a tired Latina waitress named Emma brought two hungry boys in from the snow, fed them steaming soup, and let them sit where the warmth could reach their bones, never knowing that this simple mercy would place her in the path of a secret powerful enough to rewrite her life by sunrise. She did not do it to be admired, nor to be remembered. She did it because she knew the quiet violence of being overlooked, and she could not bear to watch it happen again. In that moment, she was not thinking about consequences, only about the trembling of small hands and the hollow look that hunger leaves behind. She could not imagine that the boys she sheltered were tied to a man whose name carried weight like iron, or that her kindness had just stepped into a world that did not forgive kindness without a price. The diner itself seemed built for ordinary troubles: low chatter, clinking cups, the hum of an old heater fighting the winter at the glass. Outside, snow fell in slow sheets, wrapping the parking lot in a pale silence that made the world feel far away, while inside, the Christmas lights tried their best to make everything look gentle. Emma moved through her shift with the steady rhythm of someone who had learned to survive by being useful, thinking it would be another long night of refills and small smiles. Then she saw the boys outside, half hidden near the window, and she watched customers glance at them and look away as if cold children were part of the weather. That quiet refusal, more than the snow itself, pushed her to act. What Emma did next was not about money, because she had little of it, and it was not about heroism, because true goodness rarely announces itself. It was about dignity, the kind that insists every person deserves a door that opens. She pulled them into a corner booth where the cracked vinyl felt familiar, dried their hands with napkins, and spoke in a tone that offered safety without demanding trust. When the bowls arrived, one boy ate as if time were an enemy, while the other stared at the rising steam like he was trying to remember what warmth felt like. Emma did not ask them for a story, because she had learned that the most wounded people often need silence before they can speak. She only stayed near, guarding them with her presence, unaware that this small decision, made under soft lights and cheap garland, had just set a much larger chain into motion. The bell over the door chimed, and with it came a change so sudden that even the Christmas music sounded out of place, as if the room had shifted into a colder key. A man entered wearing a tailored blue overcoat that looked too precise for a diner like this, and he moved across the checkered floor with the calm authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Conversations thinned into whispers, and Emma noticed how even the manager's posture stiffened, as though wealth had a scent and everyone had learned to fear it. The man's eyes went first to the boys, not with curiosity, but with recognition, sharp, controlled, and frighteningly immediate. Then he stopped at Emma, reached for her hand, as if the gesture were already agreed upon, and held it up in front of the entire room. "I'm Alexander Hunt," he said, his voice smooth and certain, and the name landed like a verdict in the silence that followed. Before Emma could pull away, before she could even gather her breath, he declared, "She is my wife," and the words struck her with the force of public ownership disguised as certainty. The room reacted the way crowds often do when power chooses a target. Some leaned forward in fascination, some smiled as if they had been given entertainment, and some judged her instantly as though poverty itself were evidence of guilt. Emma felt heat rise to her face, not from romance, but from humiliation, and she steadied herself because the boys were watching her more closely than anyone else. Alexander leaned in, his composure too practiced to be innocent, and his warning slid into her ear like a locked door closing. If she walked away alone, the boys would be taken, and she would be the easiest person to blame, leaving Emma to realize that his claim was not love at all, but the first move in a battle she never agreed to fight. The words hung in the air long after Alexander Hunt released Emma's hand, as if the diner itself had been forced to swallow something bitter and could not wash it down. People did not return to their meals right away. They studied her the way strangers study a headline, hungry for meaning and quick to invent it. Emma felt every gaze land on her apron, her hair, her tired shoes, as though the smallest details could explain why a billionaire would claim a waitress in public. She kept her shoulders steady because she had learned that collapse is a luxury the world often denies to women like her. Yet inside, something small and tender recoiled, the way it always did when dignity was treated like a toy for other hands. The boys sat rigid in the booth, their eyes fixed on Emma with the quiet terror of children who have learned that adults can turn unpredictable without warning. The older one tried to look brave, lifting his chin as if courage could be borrowed from posture, while the younger pressed his sleeve to his mouth as if to hold himself in place. Emma reached for their bowls, straightened the spoons, and smoothed a napkin on the table, simple motions that created the illusion of normal life. She spoke softly, telling them to keep eating, that no one was going to drag them out of the booth, not while she was standing there. Even as she said it, she knew she was making a promise against a force she did not yet understand. Alexander remained close enough that Emma could feel him without looking, like a shadow that had decided it belonged to her. He did not smile, did not apologize, did not offer the kind of charm men often use to soften their sins. Instead, his attention kept returning to the boys, scanning them as if counting bruises the way a lawyer counts clauses. Two men in dark suits lingered near the entrance with the stillness of trained restraint, watching the room as though threats could rise from a coffee pot. Emma's manager hovered by the counter, trapped between the fear of losing a rich customer and the instinct to protect his employee, and the indecision made Emma's stomach tighten. In that moment, she understood that power does not need to shout. Sometimes it simply stands in the doorway and waits for everyone else to rearrange themselves around it. Emma finally met Alexander's eyes, and what she saw there was not romance, not even cruelty in the ordinary sense, but a controlled urgency that felt more dangerous because it was disciplined. His voice dropped, meant only for her, and he spoke as though every second was a door closing somewhere. He told her to stay calm, to say as little as possible, to let him handle it, and the words struck a nerve that had been bruised by years of being handled. Emma's pride rose like a shield, not loud, not reckless, but steady, because she refused to become a pawn in a game she did not understand. Still, beneath her anger, another truth pulsed. If he was lying, he was an arrogant man playing with her life, but if he was telling the truth, then kindness had just made her a target. When the din of whispers began to return, it did not bring comfort. It sounded like the beginning of a story she would not get to control. Emma glanced at the boys again, and something in her chest softened painfully, because their trust had already taken root, thin but real, like a fragile plant in winter soil. Alexander stepped back a fraction, as if giving her space while still keeping her within his reach, and his security shifted with him in silent coordination. Emma felt the room pressing in, judgment on one side, fear on the other, and two small hearts in the middle depending on her to choose correctly. And as she stood there trying to breathe through the shame and the rising dread, she realized the most frightening part was not that a billionaire had claimed her. It was that she could not tell whether he was protecting them or marking them for someone else to take. Emma kept moving because stillness would have betrayed her, and in a diner, motion is a kind of armor. She wiped a table that was already clean, refilled a cup nobody had asked for, and smiled at a regular who suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. The whispers stayed low but constant, like a radio playing in the next room, and she felt her name turning into something she didn't recognize. Outside, the snow continued to fall with quiet patience, indifferent to who was shamed and who was powerful. Emma told herself to focus on the boys, because focusing on them was the only way to keep her hands from shaking. It had always been like that for her. When life became too loud, she found one small task and gave it her whole heart. Years ago, in a cramped apartment that smelled of laundry soap and cheap rice, her mother had taught her that kindness wasn't a performance. It was a habit, and habits could keep a person alive. Emma remembered being a child with a thin blanket and an empty stomach, listening to Spanish lullabies that sounded like prayers, while adults argued behind a closed door. She remembered the sharp humiliation of asking for help and being told, gently but firmly, that everyone had their own problems. That was the lesson that stayed. The world often looks away, and if you become the kind of person who looks away too, you disappear inside yourself. Cedar Ridge was the kind of town that liked to call itself good, the kind that decorated early and preached about family, but still measured worth by who knew whom. Emma had learned to work hard and keep her head down, to let the diner be her stage and her shelter at the same time. She lived in a small apartment above a closed-down florist with thin walls and a heater that clicked all night like a nervous clock. Her life was simple on purpose. A few photos, a worn Bible on the nightstand, a chipped mug she refused to throw away because it reminded her she had survived worse than poverty. She didn't dream of mansions or headlines. She dreamed of peace, the kind you can breathe without permission. That was why the boys unsettled her so deeply, because they awakened a part of her she'd kept quiet to stay safe. When her shift ended, she walked them home through the snow, holding their hands so tightly it hurt her fingers, listening to their tiny breaths turn steadier with every block. In her apartment, she found spare sweatshirts, warmed water for cocoa, and watched their shoulders drop as if the world had finally stopped pushing. They didn't say much, but they watched her like people watch a fire they're afraid will go out. And when the younger one fell asleep on her couch, his face softened into something almost peaceful. Emma stood over them a long time, wondering what kind of home could lose children like this and still keep its doors locked. Later, when she hung their coats to dry, the fabric heavy with melting snow, her hand brushed a stitched tag near the collar. At first she thought it was a brand name, the sort wealthy parents liked because it looked discreet, but the letters were too clear, too deliberate, and her stomach tightened as she read them. Hunt, not printed, but embroidered like a claim, like a family crest hidden inside an ordinary winter coat. Emma's breath caught as a memory surfaced, the name Alexander Hunt, the cold voice in the diner, the way the room had changed around him, as if everyone knew what that name could do. And in the quiet of her little apartment, with 2 sleeping boys and a snowstorm outside, Emma realized she hadn't brought strangers home at all. She had brought the Hunt family into her life, and there was no gentle way to return it. Morning came with a pale winter light that made everything look too honest, and Emma woke in her small apartment to the soft sound of breathing on the couch. For a moment, she let herself believe the night had been a strange dream, that the name stitched inside a coat was nothing more than a coincidence. But then she saw it again, Hunt, and the truth settled back into her bones. The boys blinked awake slowly, wary the way children are when they've learned that safety can vanish between one moment and the next. Emma gave them toast and warm milk, spoke gently, and made small plans, because making plans was how she kept fear from turning into panic. By the time she buttoned their borrowed sweaters, she already knew she was walking back toward the place where power had put its hand on her life. The diner smelled like coffee and bleach, and the Christmas decorations looked tired in daylight, as if even the lights were embarrassed by what had happened beneath them. Emma stepped inside and felt the room notice her before anyone spoke, the way judgment does when it thinks it owns a person's story. Hank was behind the counter, his eyes flicking from her to the boys and back again, torn between concern and the instinct to protect the business from trouble. A few regulars stared too long, and one woman's lips tightened in a look that said, "Girls like you always find a way." Emma kept her chin level and guided the boys into the same corner booth because she refused to act like she was hiding. She had barely tied her apron when the bell above the door chimed again, and every muscle in her body went still. Alexander Hunt entered as if he had never left, and this time he brought the whole weight of his world with him. Two men in dark suits followed at a respectful distance, and the way they scanned the room made the diner feel suddenly smaller, like a place that could be searched, measured, controlled. Alexander's gaze went straight to the boys, and for the first time Emma noticed how carefully he held himself together, as if restraint were the only thing keeping something sharper from breaking loose. He didn't offer a greeting to the room, didn't soften his presence with small talk. He walked directly to Emma, stopping close enough that she could feel the cold from his coat. "We need to talk," he said, not unkindly, but with the expectation of obedience. Emma didn't step back, because stepping back would have meant surrender, and she had surrendered enough in her life to recognize the taste of it. He led her toward the narrow hallway near the storage room, away from the curious ears, and the moment they were out of sight of the booths, Emma's voice found its strength. "You don't get to claim me," she said, quiet but steady. "Not for protection, not for convenience, not for anything." Alexander's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his words came out like legal terms shaped into human language. Risk, exposure, custody, emergency petition, as though he could build safety out of paperwork alone. He told her there were people watching for the boys, people who would twist her kindness into a crime and drag her through it without mercy. Emma heard the warning, but she also heard the arrogance beneath it, the assumption that fear was an acceptable tool if it produced the right outcome. "Then tell me the truth," she demanded, "because I won't be used to solve a problem you created." For the first time, Alexander's control faltered, not into emotion, but into something more revealing. A silence that admitted he was afraid of what the truth would cost. Behind them, from the booth, the older boy's small voice drifted through the diner's thin walls, trembling as if the word itself carried danger. "Dad," he whispered. Not loud enough to be sure of it, but loud enough to turn Emma's blood cold. Alexander's eyes closed for a fraction of a second, like a man bracing himself, and when he opened them again, he looked older than his wealth, burdened by something money had not corrected. "There's a woman named Marianne Cross," he said at last, and the name came out with a sharpness he couldn't hide, as if it belonged to a threat that wore perfume and smiled in courtrooms. Emma felt the ground shift under her, because she understood then that this wasn't only about two lost boys, it was about an enemy with a plan, and she had already been pulled into it without being asked. And as Alexander turned back toward the booth, his voice lowered into a warning that left no room for comfort, Emma realized she was standing at the edge of a decision that would change everything, whether she wanted it or not. By noon, the diner had already decided what Emma was, and the story people told themselves required no facts to feel true. A waitress who got claimed by a billionaire was either a liar with a plan or a girl who finally found a rich man to rescue her, and neither version left room for her actual heart. Hank avoided her eyes as he counted the register, as if looking at her too long would pull him into trouble, and the other servers spoke in half-sentences that stopped when she walked by. Emma carried plates the way she always did, steady and quiet, but every step felt heavier, as though the floor itself had become judgment. The boys sat close together in their booth, watching faces the way cornered animals watch hands. Alexander returned before the lunch rush ended, and this time he didn't arrive with theatre, only with inevitability. He sat across from Emma in the back corner, turning the diner's chipped table into a boardroom by the simple force of his posture. When he spoke, he chose his words like a man who had learned that language can be a weapon if it's clean enough. No warmth, no softness, only terms and outcomes. He told her there were people with authority who would claim the boys were endangered by her, that a kind act could be twisted into abduction, that her lack of money would be painted as motive. Emma listened, jaw tight, because she recognized the pattern. In the world she came from, the truth often lost to whoever could afford to repeat their version the loudest. She tried to keep her voice calm, but pain leaked through it anyway, because it was one thing to be poor and another to be treated like a crime waiting to happen. "You humiliated me," she said, the words tasting like iron. "And now you're telling me it was for my own good." Alexander's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something closer to regret he refused to name, and for a moment he looked like a man who had survived by never letting himself feel. He admitted that the declaration had been a shield, crude and brutal, but faster than explanations, and speed was what he needed last night. Emma hated that she understood the logic, because understanding did not heal the wound of being used in front of a roomful of strangers. Then he placed a small box on the table, black and expensive, so out of place beside ketchup bottles that it looked almost obscene. He didn't open it right away, letting its presence do what his voice could not: announce consequences, invite assumptions, bait the town into believing a fantasy. "A temporary arrangement," he said, as if proposing a contract, not a life. His name would protect her from accusations. Her presence would keep the boys calm, and together they would close whatever door Marianne Cross was trying to open. Emma stared at the box and felt her throat tighten, because it wasn't the jewelry that frightened her. It was the way he thought the symbol could solve the human part of this. The boys glanced at the box too, and in their faces Emma saw not greed or excitement, but fear that adults were trading them like property. Emma did not touch the box, because touching it felt like agreeing to be packaged and carried. She looked at Alexander instead, searching for something honest beneath the cold precision, and found it in the one place he couldn't control: the tension at the edge of his mouth when the boys shifted closer to her. "I'll do what I have to do for them," she said slowly, "but I won't be owned, not by your money, not by your name, not by your fear." Alexander held her gaze as if measuring the cost of letting her stay free, and the diner around them seemed to hold its breath again. When Emma finally nodded, not yes, not no, but something fragile in between, she felt a quiet dread settle in her chest, because she could already sense that accepting his protection might demand a price her dignity could not afford. Emma told herself she was only agreeing to one dinner, one appearance, one controlled hour in a world that did not belong to her, because the boys needed calm more than she needed comfort. She repeated that thought the way people repeat a prayer when fear tries to speak louder than reason. Still, when Alexander's driver opened the car door and the warmth of expensive leather met her skin, she felt the old ache of being judged before she even said a word. The boys sat close beside her in borrowed coats, their eyes wide with the stunned quiet of children who have seen too much too young. Emma held their hands in her lap, steady and protective, and promised herself she would not let anyone turn them into trophies. The mansion rose from the snowy hills like a bright, silent fortress, all stone and glass and perfect landscaping that winter could not make messy. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and polish, and every surface seemed designed to reflect a life without struggle. Staff moved with soft, trained steps, not quite invisible, but never fully present, and Emma felt her own breath become too loud in the high ceilings. Alexander guided them forward with a light touch on her back that pretended to be courteous while quietly steering her where he wanted her. The boys' shoulders tightened as they crossed the threshold, as if they could sense the difference between warmth given freely and warmth owned by power. Emma's pride rose in her chest like a spine straightening because she knew the moment she acted small, the house would swallow her whole. In the dining room, the light from a chandelier spilled over the table in clean brilliance, turning the crystal glasses into little frozen stars. Faces turned as they entered, men in tailored suits, women in elegant dresses, smiles arranged in the careful way people smile when they are deciding whether you are acceptable. Emma felt their eyes sweep over her simple coat, her hands, her accent when she said a polite hello, and she recognized the old message hidden beneath their politeness. You are here by mistake. Alexander, for all his power, seemed to believe he could manage the room like an investment, placing her at his side, speaking for her when silence grew sharp, controlling the angle of every perception. But Emma had survived a lifetime of rooms that tried to make her disappear, and she refused to let this one succeed. He offered her a dress that fit too perfectly to be accidental, and in the softness of the fabric she felt the weight of expectation, the unspoken demand that she become a version of herself that would offend no one. He corrected the way she held her fork, the way she answered questions, the way she looked at the table when people stared too long and each small correction landed like a bruise. Emma did not raise her voice. She simply stopped allowing his hand to guide her, and the quiet defiance in that movement spoke louder than an argument. I will not be edited, she said, not for the room to hear, but for him to understand. Because dignity is often defended in whispers before it can survive in public. Alexander's expression hardened, then softened in a way that suggested he was losing control of something he had never learned to hold gently. Later, when she stepped into a hallway to breathe, she heard voices behind a half-closed door, low, urgent and careless with cruelty, because they believed no one like her belonged close enough to understand. A woman's voice, smooth and confident, spoke about timing and paperwork, about removing the boys before the weekends, as if children were assets to be transferred. Another voice agreed, laughing softly, and the sound made Emma's stomach turn because it carried the comfort of people who had never feared consequences. Emma pressed her palm to the cold wall, feeling her pulse hammer, and in that moment the mansion's beauty revealed its true shape, not a home but a machine. She returned to the dining room with her face composed and her heart on fire, already knowing that whatever came next would not ask permission, and that her choice to walk into this world had placed her one step closer to something ready to strike. Emma woke before dawn, with the strange, quiet hope that sometimes follows a hard night, the kind that tries to convince you nothing truly bad can happen when children are finally warm and asleep. For a few seconds she lay still, listening for the small sounds that had begun to soothe her, soft breaths, a cough, the rustle of a blanket. But the apartment gave her only silence, too clean and too complete, as if the air itself had been wiped down. She sat up fast, her heart already running ahead of her body, and looked toward the couch where the boys had fallen asleep. The blanket was folded back, the pillows undisturbed, and the spot where their small bodies had been was empty, like they had never existed there at all. She crossed the room in 2 steps, calling their names softly at first, then louder, because panic always starts as denial. She checked the bathroom, the tiny kitchen, the corner by the heater, even though she knew children did not vanish into corners without a reason. The front door was locked, the window latch intact, the chain still hanging in place, no splintered wood, no broken glass, nothing that would make the world admit a crime. That was what frightened her most. The absence of force made the disappearance feel planned, and plans belonged to people who had power. Emma's hands shook as she searched for a note, a footprint, a dropped mitten, any sign that could prove she hadn't imagined them. She found nothing, only the stitched name on the drying coats, and suddenly even that felt like a warning rather than comfort. By the time she reached the diner, the sky was still grey, and the Christmas lights in the windows looked like tired lies. Hank was unlocking the door when she arrived, and the moment he saw her face, he stiffened, as though trouble had finally come to claim its seat. Emma tried to speak, but her voice broke in the middle, and the break embarrassed her more than tears ever could, because she could hear what it sounded like to people who already doubted her. "They're gone," she managed, gripping the edge of the counter as if the laminate could keep her upright. Hank's eyes flicked around the empty room and then back to her, calculating, fearful, already thinking about liability and headlines. Within minutes, the phone calls began, and in a small town, help always arrives carrying suspicion in its pocket. The police questions were polite at first, then pointed, then quietly cruel in the way authority can be when it believes it is being patient. Where did she find them? Why did she take them home? Did she contact anyone? Did she ask permission? Did she understand how this looked? Emma answered every question, but she could feel the shape of the accusation forming around her, tightening like a net. A young officer glanced at her apartment address and raised his eyebrows, and Emma saw the unspoken thought. Someone like you doesn't just end up with billionaire children on her couch. She felt the world trying to turn her kindness into a charge, her compassion into evidence, and the humiliation of the diner returned with a sharper edge. The boys' faces flashed in her mind, wide eyes, chapped lips, the way they leaned toward her warmth, and Emma realized she was the only adult who had promised them safety without paperwork. Alexander arrived late, and when he stepped through the diner door, he looked less like a man in control and more like a man who had failed at the one thing he could not purchase back. His jaw was tight, his coat open, his hair slightly undone, as if he had been moving too fast to care about appearances. The two suited men followed him, but their posture had changed. They were no longer confident shadows. They were searching, alert, uneasy. Alexander's gaze found Emma immediately, and when he saw the fear in her eyes, something in him shifted, the hard surface cracking just enough to reveal raw panic beneath. He spoke to the officers in a low, forceful tone, using names and titles Emma didn't recognize, pulling strings she couldn't see, and for the first time she understood how quickly his power could change the direction of a room. Yet even with all that power, he could not change the simplest truth. The boys were gone. Emma's phone buzzed while Alexander was still arguing with the officer at the counter, and the sound cut through her like a blade. She looked down and saw an unknown number, her hands suddenly cold despite the diner's heat. The message was short, almost casual, and that casualness made it monstrous. "Walk away, or you'll never see them again." Emma's breath stopped, because the threat felt personal, not random, like someone had been watching her heart and knew exactly where to press. She lifted her eyes to Alexander, and for a moment they stared at each other across the space between wealth and poverty, pride and fear, both of them understanding the same terrible thing. Whoever had taken the boys wasn't just moving against him. They were moving through her now, and they had already decided she was the weakest link to break. Emma did not remember leaving the diner. Only the way the air outside burned her lungs, and the snow seemed to fall with cruel calm, as if the world refused to acknowledge what had been stolen. She walked until the streets grew quieter and the lights grew fewer, her mind repeating the text message like a curse she could not unhear. The words "walk away" struck her with a particular kind of poison, because running had always been the easiest instinct in her life, when bills piled up, when people judged, when doors closed. But the boys' faces kept interrupting that instinct, not as a memory, but as a responsibility, and she felt something firm take shape inside her, something that did not belong to fear. By the time she pushed open the heavy wooden door of the small church at the end of the street, her hands were shaking, yet her steps carried a decision she hadn't fully named. Inside, the sanctuary was dim and quiet, and the last of the Christmas wreaths still hung near the altar, their red ribbon darkened by shadow. A few candles burned low, flickering whenever the old building sighed with winter wind, and the smell of wax and pine settled into Emma's chest like a tired comfort. She slid into a pew near the back and stared at the soft flame nearest her, willing it to feel warm enough to reach her thoughts. She had prayed before, in moments like this, not with eloquence, not with certainty, but with the stubborn hope that someone, somewhere, still heard her. Tonight, the prayer did not come out in words. It came out in the way she pressed her palms together and tried not to break. In the silence, her shame returned. The scene in the diner, the stares, the claim, and it mixed with fear until she could hardly tell which one hurt more. Alexander arrived without fanfare, his presence announced only by the quiet closing of the church door and the faint echo of his steps on the stone floor. He looked out of place in that modest sanctuary, too polished, too heavy with a world that didn't fit between wooden pews, yet he moved as if he had nowhere else to put himself. He sat a few feet away, not beside her, and that distance felt like the first respectful thing he had done since the night he took her hand. For a long moment neither of them spoke, as if language was too fragile to hold what had happened. Emma noticed the way his shoulders stayed tense, even when he sat still, like a man trying to keep the worst parts of himself from spilling out. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she expected, and the quiet carried something heavier than command. It carried blame. He told her the threat was not new, that Marianne Cross had been circling his family for years with the patience of someone who knew the law could be bent if you had enough influence to press it. He spoke of a custody battle that never felt like a custody battle, but like a negotiation over something valuable, and of paperwork that had been filed in the shadows long before Emma ever saw two boys shivering outside a diner window. The boy's mother, he admitted, was gone, and the official words sounded clean: accident, tragedy, unresolved details. But the truth underneath them was jagged. Marianne had positioned herself where she could move pieces without being touched, and Alexander had spent too long believing that money and distance could protect his sons. "I thought I could control it," he said, and the confession came out like a bruise being pressed. "And I was wrong." Emma listened, and for the first time she heard something human beneath the billionaire's polished certainty. Fear, yes, but also regret that could not be paid off. Emma's anger rose again, because regret did not erase what he had done to her, and she refused to let compassion turn into permission. "You used me," she said, steadying her voice against the tremble in her hands. "And now, they've used me too." Alexander did not argue, and the lack of defense surprised her more than any apology might have. He stared toward the altar, as if looking at something older than both of them, and when he spoke again, it was with the careful honesty of a man who understood he had run out of acceptable lies. He explained that the wife claim had been a shield against a specific legal trap, an emergency move that would give him time and standing before Marianne could file something that labeled Emma a kidnapper and made the boys vanish into a system that could be bought. It was strategy, not romance, and hearing that did not soften Emma's humiliation. It only clarified it, sharpening the question in her chest. If everything about him was strategy, then where did that leave her heart? And where did it leave the boys who had already begun to see her as safe? When Emma stood to leave, she did not feel peace, only resolve, and even that resolve felt like a heavy coat she wasn't sure she could carry. The text message still burned in her pocket, daring her to step back and save herself, and for a brief moment she imagined the relief of obedience, walking away, letting wealth fight wealth, letting power eat power. But then she pictured the boys waking in a strange place, calling for her, realizing she had vanished the same way everyone else had vanished in their short lives. That image steadied her more than any candle or prayer, because it turned fear into purpose. Emma faced Alexander in the dim aisle, her voice low but unbreakable, and told him she would not walk away, not because she trusted him, but because she would not abandon two children who had already learned what abandonment feels like. And as Alexander nodded once, as if accepting a truth he could not command, Emma understood that protecting the boys might require standing beside the very man who had humiliated her, even while her heart still didn't know whether he was saving a family or simply trying not to lose one again. The next few days passed in a blur of unanswered questions and unsaid words, the kind of days that weigh heavy in your chest without offering any direction forward. Emma spent hours poring over the few details Alexander had given her, trying to stitch together a plan from the fragments of his explanation. She moved through the motions of her routine at the diner, the dishes clinking and the coffee brewing, but her thoughts never really left the boys. The quiet fear that had settled over her never fully lifted, because every time she tried to rest, a small, gnawing voice reminded her that there were people watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. Despite the weight of everything pressing down on her, there was still something about the boys that refused to let her crumble. They weren't just lost children. They were fragments of her own life, reminders of a time when she was that child, overlooked, dismissed, but still worthy of protection. Every time she looked at them, she saw not just the fear in their eyes, but the small spark of hope that came when she was near. They didn't trust easily, but they trusted her, and in that quiet exchange, something in Emma began to grow. She could no longer see herself as the one who had been taken advantage of. She was the one with the power to act, to protect, to give them a chance at something better. Alexander, for all his cold efficiency, seemed to understand that she was no longer willing to be his pawn. He came to the diner not to command, but to ask, to plead, to offer any support he could, though his offers were always laced with conditions. "We need to move fast," he would say, the urgency in his voice now tinged with real fear. "Marianne won't stop until she has full control. If we wait too long, they could disappear forever." Emma listened, weighing each word, each potential outcome. But she knew deep down that the question was never about moving fast. It was about moving with intention, about finding a way to protect the boys without losing herself in the process. For once, she was not just a pawn in someone else's game. She was the one who would decide what the next move would be. One evening, as the Christmas lights outside flickered dimly in the winter air, Emma found herself walking with Alexander through the town square after another tense meeting in a law office. He had just finished talking to his lawyer, and the weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy fog. "The only way to win this," he said, "is to prove we are the stable family they deserve." Emma stopped in her tracks, the words hitting her like a bucket of cold water. "A family," she repeated, her voice catching slightly. The word seemed foreign, too big for what she could offer. She wasn't a family. She was just Emma, a tired waitress who had grown accustomed to being alone. She glanced at him, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes, the same weariness that had settled in her own bones. But there was something else there now, too. A flicker of something, buried beneath the cold calculations and the hard edge of his pride. "Yes," Alexander said softly, looking at her with an intensity that felt different than before. "I need you to understand that this isn't just about keeping them safe. It's about giving them something they've never had. Something stable. Something real." Emma felt a surge of something inside her, anger, fear, confusion, but also, oddly, a sense of peace. She could no longer pretend that she was simply trying to survive. She had something to fight for now, something worth holding on to. The boys. the hope that she could give them the life they deserved. It was no longer about Alexander's money or power. It was about creating a home for them, a home where love wasn't determined by legal papers or wealth, but by the quiet strength of people who cared. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emma let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for a future where they weren't just surviving, but living. And as they walked toward the diner, side by side, Emma felt a small, steadying sense of clarity. The road ahead would not be easy. It would require sacrifices, decisions she wasn't sure she was ready to make, but she was ready for the fight. For the first time, she wasn't walking alone, and that was enough to give her the strength to keep going. The first real shift came from someone the town rarely noticed, which was fitting because hope often arrives dressed like ordinary routine. It was Ruth, the older waitress with careful eyes and a habit of wiping the same spot twice, who waited until the morning rush thinned before leaning close to Emma behind the counter. Her voice stayed low, but her certainty was steady, as if she had been carrying this piece of truth in her apron pocket all along. She told Emma she had seen a luxury sedan idling behind the diner the night the boys were brought inside, its engine humming like Patience, its windows too dark to read. And because Ruth had lived long enough to trust her instincts over anyone's reputation, she had written Thelicent's plate number on a small notepad and kept it, just in case the world tried to pretend it didn't happen. Emma's hands went cold as she stared at Ruth's handwriting, the numbers circled with a firmness that made them feel like a lifeline. When Alexander arrived, Emma didn't wait for him to speak. She placed the note in front of him and watched his expression tighten as he read it. For the first time in days, something like direction cut through the fog, and even Alexander's cold efficiency seemed less like dominance and more like desperate focus. He made calls that sounded like commands, but he also listened, really listened, when Emma insisted they move quietly, because whoever took the boys was counting on loud chaos. The diner's warmth suddenly felt thin against the winter outside, yet Emma's spine stayed straight, because a mother's courage, even an unchosen one, does not ask permission to exist. Ruth patted Emma's shoulder once, gentle and brief, and that small human touch carried more strength than all the polished promises in Alexander's world. They followed the plate the way people follow a thread through darkness, pulling gently so it wouldn't break. It led them to a foundation name that sounded charitable and clean, the kind of organization that put smiling children on brochures while hiding sharp edges behind fine print. Emma and Alexander drove through Cedar Ridge's quiet streets and out toward offices that looked too modern for the town, where glass walls displayed generosity like jewelry. Inside, they met polite smiles that did not reach the eyes, receptionist voices trained to deflect, and paperwork that seemed designed to make questions die of exhaustion. Emma noticed how easily a person could disappear inside forms and policies, how the truth could be delayed until it became irrelevant, and she felt anger rise, not wild, but clear. Alexander's money opened doors, yet even he seemed unsettled by how smoothly those doors tried to close again, as if someone higher up had already been warned. From there, the trail pulled them into places that smelled of disinfectant and quiet fear. A county office with fluorescent lights and worn chairs, a courthouse hallway where people spoke in whispers like prayers, and finally a private clinic whose lobby looked too calm, too expensive, too perfect. Emma watched Alexander's jaw harden as he spoke with administrators who insisted on privacy, and she realized that privacy in the hands of the wrong people could be another word for control. She saw him reach for his usual weapon, authority, then stop, as if remembering that force had already failed once and that children were not problems to be solved. So Emma stepped forward instead, softening her voice, not to beg, but to invite the smallest crack of conscience in a stranger's face. "I'm not asking for gossip," she said, eyes steady. "I'm asking for two boys who are afraid." A nurse approached as they turned to leave, her badge swinging slightly, her expression caught between duty and regret. She didn't speak at first, only glanced toward the front desk, then toward the hallway, as if measuring how much courage she could afford. When she finally moved, she did it quickly, slipping a folded note into Emma's palm, the way someone slips bread to the hungry, quietly, urgently, with the hope of not being seen. Emma's fingers closed around the paper, feeling the tremor in the nurse's touch, and her stomach tightened before she even opened it. The message inside was short, written in hurried strokes, but it landed like thunder in her chest. They were brought here, but not as patients. Emma didn't open the nurse's note until they were back in the car, doors shut, heater running, the outside world muffled by glass and falling snow. The paper felt too light for the weight it carried, and when she read the words again, not as patients, her mind filled the gaps with cold possibilities. Alexander took the note from her hand and read it once, then again, his jaw tightening as if he were biting down on anger to keep it from spilling. For the first time, his silence didn't feel like control. It felt like a man staring at a door he'd tried to keep locked, realizing someone had been inside all along. Emma watched his knuckles whiten around the paper and understood that whatever this was, it had been planned with a cruelty that hid behind legitimacy. They returned to the diner because it was the only place that still felt real, the only place where Emma could breathe without marble walls and polite lies pressing against her skin. Ruth was there, wiping down the counter with the same steady motion, and when she saw their faces, she didn't ask for details, only poured coffee like a small act of resistance against helplessness. Emma sat with her hands wrapped around the mug, feeling the heat seep into her palms, as if warmth could convince her heart to keep beating calmly. Alexander stood near the window, looking out at the street as if he expected someone to appear at any moment, and the posture made him seem less like a billionaire and more like a guard who'd failed his post. The diner's Christmas lights blinked softly, stubbornly cheerful, and Emma hated them for pretending everything could still be simple. "You're going to tell me the whole truth," Emma said at last, her voice quiet but anchored, the kind of tone that doesn't beg and doesn't threaten because it doesn't need to. Not the clean version, not the legal version, the truth. Alexander turned slowly, and for a moment his face held the same cold mask she'd seen on the night he claimed her, but it cracked under the strain of what he was carrying. He didn't sit down like a man making conversation. He sat down like a man stepping into confession, as if the chair itself were a place he didn't deserve. When he spoke, he chose each word carefully, and the care was almost worse than cruelty, because it meant he had been measuring what she could handle. He told her the wife declaration had been a shield, but not against gossip, not against embarrassment, not even against the town's judgment. It had been against a legal strike designed to erase her overnight. Marianne Cross, he explained, had prepared an emergency petition that could label Emma a danger and the boys at risk. And once that label existed, truth would become slow, expensive, and easy to bury. A spouse, however, could stand in certain proceedings as next-of-kin advocate, could stall a removal, could force a hearing before the boys disappeared into someone else's custody. He said it with a businessman's precision, like numbers on a ledger, and Emma felt her humiliation sharpen into something steadier: clarity. He had used her name as a shield because he believed speed mattered more than consent, and now he was asking her to keep standing there while the arrows kept coming. Then his voice lowered further, and the room seemed to lean in despite itself, because the next part didn't sound like strategy at all. It sounded like grief. The boy's mother, he admitted, hadn't simply died the way the headlines implied. She had vanished into a maze of contracts, guardianship clauses, and a fortune's shadow, and Marianne had been named executor of pieces that never should have belonged to her. Alexander slid a worn photograph across the table, the edges bent from being handled too many times in private pain, and Emma stared at the image of a smiling woman holding the boys when they were younger, her eyes bright with a warmth the world hadn't protected. Emma's breath caught, not because the woman was beautiful, but because she recognized her. Seen weeks ago, sitting alone at the diner with untouched coffee, hands trembling slightly as if she were deciding whether to run. And as Emma's memory snapped into place with terrifying certainty, she understood that her kindness hadn't started a new story at all. It had stepped into the middle of an old one, and the next page was already stained. The office where Marianne Cross received them did not look like a place where children could be taken, only a place where decisions were polished until they sounded humane. Glass walls caught the winter light and turned it into something sharp, and the air smelled faintly of expensive perfume layered over paper and ink. Emma felt the building's quiet confidence the way she felt cold through thin gloves, seeping in, insisting she did not belong. Alexander walked beside her, composed, but she could sense the tension in him, the way a storm holds itself back before it breaks. In Emma's pocket, the nurse's note might as well have been burning coal, reminding her that kindness had been dragged into a courtroom without a judge. Marianne rose when they entered, smiling as if she had been expecting them, as if fear and grief were appointments on her calendar. She was elegant in a way that looked effortless, the kind of woman who could ruin someone with a compliment spoken at the right moment. "Emma?" she said, tasting the name as though it were a curiosity, then turning to Alexander with the easy familiarity of someone who believed she had shaped his life. Her handshake was brief, her eyes steady, and Emma realized Marianne's warmth was not kindness. It was control pretending to be polite. Even the assistant in the corner moved like a witness, already trained on what to remember. Marianne didn't begin with the boys. She began with Emma, because the simplest way to win was to make the weaker person feel small. She spoke of instability with a gentle tone, as if she were concerned, and referenced Emma's job and apartment with the casual pity of someone who believed poverty was a character flaw. She implied that Emma had inserted herself into a wealthy family's crisis for attention, for security, for a story to sell, and she did it while keeping her smile soft enough to look innocent. Emma felt her cheeks heat, not with shame this time, but with anger that had finally matured into certainty. She did not raise her voice. She simply held Marianne's gaze and refused to flinch, because dignity is not proven by wealth, but by steadiness under insult. When Emma spoke, she did not defend herself with desperation, only with truth, and the truth sounded plain enough to shame a room. She described two boys outside a diner on Christmas, shaking with cold, hungry in a way no child should ever be hungry, and she described the way the world looked past them as if they were trash blown into the snow. She said she did not bring them inside for reward, and she did not keep them for romance or money, because she had never needed a billionaire to teach her what love required. Alexander didn't interrupt her, and that silence was a change. He let her words stand on their own weight, then placed documents on the desk like a quiet hammer. For the first time, his power was not used to dominate the room, but to support the truth she had already spoken. Marianne's smile thinned, not because she had been defeated, but because she had reached the moment where softness no longer served her. She leaned forward and slid a single paper across the desk, her voice turning sweeter, almost conversational, as she hinted at signatures, past records, and a version of Emma's life that could be twisted into a weapon. The page looked ordinary, just ink and margins, yet Emma felt the threat in it, like a shadow falling over the future. Alexander's eyes hardened as he read, and Emma understood that Marianne had not brought them here to negotiate. She had brought them here to choose who would bleed first. And as Emma stared at that paper, she felt a familiar fear rise again. Not of losing her reputation, but of losing the boys to a system that could be bought with one clean stroke of a pen. The paper Marianne slid forward looked harmless at first glance, the kind of document that could be filed, stamped, and forgotten by anyone who had never been crushed by paperwork. Emma read the first lines and felt her stomach tighten, not because the words were complicated, but because they were designed to sound official while implying something ugly about her. It was a protective statement, dressed in concern, meant to paint her as unstable, impulsive, and potentially dangerous, just enough poison to make future accusations stick. Marianne's pen hovered above the signature line, like a blade held politely, and her voice stayed soft as she said, almost kindly, that signing would simplify everything. Emma understood the trap with sudden clarity. The signature wasn't for safety, it was for surrender. Emma did something Marianne didn't expect. She didn't argue, she didn't beg, and she didn't reach for Alexander to fight on her behalf. She set the paper down carefully, as if refusing to wrinkle, it was a way of refusing to be wrinkled by it, and she folded her hands in her lap until the shaking passed. "I won't sign something I don't believe," she said, calm enough to make the words feel like stone. Marianne's smile faltered for the first time, the tiniest crack in her practiced composure, and Emma saw it for what it was. Surprise that a waitress could stand up straight in a room built to bend people. Alexander watched Emma with an expression that wasn't ownership anymore, but recognition, like he was seeing, perhaps for the first time, what real strength looks like when it has nothing to prove. Alexander placed another folder on the desk, thicker, heavier, and far less polite than Marianne's single page. Ruth's license plate note had led to a trail of registrations, invoices, and foundation transfers, small clues that only mattered when you lined them up and refused to look away. Then came the piece that changed the air completely, a recovered clip from the diner's rear security camera, the one that was supposedly missing, pulled from an old backup drive Hank had never bothered to erase. The footage showed the luxury sedan behind the diner, the dark silhouette of a driver stepping out, and a second figure handing something over, an envelope, a phone, a set of keys, before the car rolled off into the snow like it had never been there. Marianne's assistant shifted in the corner, and the movement was subtle, but it carried panic the way a held breath carries truth. The nurse's testimony arrived next, not in the room, but in the form of a sworn statement that Alexander's lawyer had obtained within the hour. It described the boys being brought through a side entrance of the clinic, listed as administrative intake, not patients, and escorted by a private security team linked to the same foundation the plate had traced. Marianne tried to dismiss it as misunderstanding, but her voice had changed. It was still controlled, yet it no longer sounded effortless. Emma watched Marianne's eyes flicker to the door and back, measuring escape routes in a place where she had always felt untouchable. The truth, once it has enough witnesses, becomes heavier than money. By evening, authority finally moved in the right direction, and Emma learned a painful lesson. Justice often arrives late, but it does arrive when enough ordinary people refuse to be silent. The boys were found in a quiet property outside town, kept clean, fed just enough to keep them compliant, watched by people paid to treat childhood like cargo. Emma reached them first, because she ran through that door as if every mile of her past had been training for this moment. She didn't overwhelm them with speeches. She wrapped them in blankets, pressed her cheek to their hair, and whispered the only thing that mattered. She had come back. She had not walked away. Their bodies shook with relief, and the sound of their sobbing made Emma's eyes burn, because it was the sound of children realizing they were not alone anymore. Alexander arrived seconds later and stopped as if he had been struck, because the boys moved toward Emma before they moved toward him, their hands finding hers with instinctive trust. In that small, unmistakable choice, the room changed in a way no court order could imitate, and something in Alexander finally broke open, not into rage, but into humility. He knelt in front of them, not performing for cameras, not commanding anyone, but simply lowering himself until his face was level with theirs. "I'm sorry," he said, voice rough with a regret he could not polish, and Emma felt the truth of it settle between them like a fragile beginning. In the quiet that followed, with the boys clinging to her sleeves as if she were home, Emma understood that the world was watching a new story being written, one where love was not claimed, but chosen, and where the most powerful thing in the room was the hand a child decided to hold. The days after the boys were found did not feel like victory so much as a long exhale that still hurt on the way out. Emma stayed close to them in the quiet hours, watching them relearn simple things, how to fall asleep without listening for footsteps, how to laugh without immediately checking whether laughter was allowed. Alexander's mansion, once a fortress of perfection, began to look different to her, not because the marble softened, but because she understood how easily beauty can hide fear. Staff moved gently around the children now, careful not to startle them, and even the silence in the hallways seemed to change, as if the house itself had realized it was being asked to become a home. Emma did not pretend the pain was over, but she also refused to let pain be the only language the boys grew up speaking. Alexander tried to do what he had always done, fix things with decisive action, but this time his actions came with an unfamiliar hesitation, like a man learning that control is not the same as care. He offered Emma a formal apology in writing, not as a grand gesture, but as a record he could not rewrite later, and he insisted on making a public statement to correct the rumors that had painted her as a schemer. He told reporters, lawyers, and anyone who would listen that his wife's claim had been wrong in the way it was delivered, even if it had been made in desperation, and Emma watched his pride swallow itself for the sake of truth. It did not erase the humiliation, but it did something rarer. It honored it, admitting it had happened. For Emma, that admission mattered more than any ring box ever could. Still, Emma held her boundaries like a hand over a candle flame, protecting what little warmth she had left from being blown out again. She told Alexander plainly that she would not be owned, not by his fear, not by his money, not by his need to win, and she refused to let gratitude become a leash. She stayed for the boys, and she said that out loud because she wanted everyone, including herself, to remember why she was there. Alexander listened, and the listening looked like work on him, like a muscle he had ignored for too long. He did not argue, and he did not demand. In that restraint, Emma sensed the beginning of something that could be real, not because it was dramatic, but because it was chosen moment by moment. Outside the mansion, Cedar Ridge began to shift in the small way towns shift when they realize their cruelty has witnesses. Ruth's calm testimony traveled faster than gossip, and people who had avoided Emma's eyes started nodding at her in the grocery store, offering awkward kindness, as if it could replace the harm they had done. Emma accepted none of it like a prize, but she stored the better parts in her heart for the boys, because children deserve to see that communities can learn. The boys, in their honest way, started calling Emma home without making it sentimental, just factual, the way you name what keeps you safe. Each time they said it, something in Emma's chest tightened and softened at once, because love had arrived in her life the way snow arrives, quietly covering everything before you realize the world has changed. Then the letter came on an ordinary afternoon, slipped under the mansion's front door, as if it had every right to enter. Emma recognized the official seal before she even opened it, and the paper inside smelled faintly of ink and inevitability. The court date had been moved up, accelerated without explanation, and the language hinted at new information that would be presented. Information about Emma, not about Marianne, not about the boys, but about the parts of Emma's past she had spent years surviving in silence. Alexander read it over her shoulder, his face going still in a way that made Emma's stomach drop, because she could tell he understood exactly what weapon someone had decided to use next. And as Emma stared at the date printed in cold black type, she realized the fight was no longer only about saving the boys, it was about whether her own history would be used to tear them from her hands. The courthouse, on the morning of the hearing, felt colder than the streets outside, as if stone and fluorescent light could drain warmth from a person's skin. Emma walked in with her shoulders squared, not because she was fearless, but because the boys' hands were in hers, and she would not teach them that love runs when it's tested. Alexander stayed a respectful step behind, present without trying to steer her, and that quiet restraint was its own kind of apology. Across the room, Marianne Cross sat with the calm expression of someone who trusted paper more than truth. Emma looked at the judge's bench and reminded herself that dignity is not something you are granted. It is something you carry in, even when you're shaking. When Emma's past was brought forward, it came the way Marianne intended, neat, selective, and sharp at the edges. Old hardships were framed as flaws, survival choices were dressed up as sins, and every painful chapter Emma had outlived was offered to the court like proof that she didn't deserve the boys. Emma felt the familiar heat of shame try to rise, but she didn't let it take her voice. She spoke plainly about where she came from, what she endured, and how she learned to become steady instead of bitter. She did not ask for pity. She offered the truth as testimony, the kind that doesn't sparkle but does not break. Then the room began to change, not with drama, but with the weight of consistent facts and human witnesses. Ruth's statement was read aloud. The clinic's sworn account followed, and the timeline Marianne tried to polish started to crumble under its own contradictions. The boys' counselor spoke of their fear and the way their bodies calmed in Emma's presence, as if safety had finally found a name they could trust. Alexander admitted his failures without decorating them, acknowledging that control had once mattered more to him than consent, and that he was learning, slowly, painfully, how to be a father who earns closeness instead of demanding it. Even the judge's expressions softened, not because the world suddenly became kind, but because the truth had been given enough room to stand. When the decision came, it did not sound like a fairy tale, and that was what made it real. The court recognized what mattered most, the boys' stability, Emma's consistent care without coercion, and Alexander's visible effort to change the pattern that had left his children vulnerable. A new arrangement was set with clear boundaries, protections, and a path forward that put the boys' well-being above anyone's pride. Emma felt tears gather, not as triumph, but as release, because for the first time in a long time, the system had seen her heart instead of her paycheck. The boys squeezed her hands, and in that small pressure she felt the simple, powerful truth she had been fighting for. They were not alone anymore. Winter deepened, and life settled into a gentler rhythm, still imperfect, still healing, but no longer ruled by fear. Emma returned to the diner sometimes, tying on her apron the way a person returns to a place where courage first proved itself. And the regulars greeted her differently now, not with gossip, but with quiet respect. Alexander learned to show up without overshadowing, to listen without buying silence, and to understand that being chosen is a gift no fortune can force. On some evenings, the four of them sat by a window watching snow fall, warm behind glass, and Emma would feel peace arrive in the simplest way, like a door that stays open, like a light that doesn't flicker when the wind comes. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.